Good afternoon, and thank you very much for joining us today for this LIDC webinar on the informal economy and economic activity. Before I hand you over to our moderator, Dr. William Monteith of Queen Mary University in London, who's very kindly agreed to come in and do this service for us today, I'll just say a few words about the format of the event and about LIDC itself. So as you will be aware from the email that you should have received, this event is going to be recorded and we'll be posting it on our website. We'll also be sharing it via our social media feeds. We do encourage people to live tweet about our events. Our Twitter handle is @LIDC_UK, and you can use the hashtag LIDC seminars if you choose. There will be time for questions and answers after our panelists have finished their introductions. We would very much appreciate it if you could indicate that you wish to come on screen and speak by using the appropriate icon to raise your hand. And also if you could type your question in the Q&A section that you will find on the bottom of your screen. Please avoid using the chat for questions because we'll probably miss them if you put them in the chat. But of course, do use the chat if you wish to chat. So a few words about LIDC. Many of you will know that we are a membership organisation. We have membership that's drawn from researchers, academics, students, and members of the general public who are interested in solving intractable or seemingly intractable problems in the global development landscapes. We have institutional members from a number of higher education institutions and a number of NGOs, such as WaterAid, Oxfam, and so on. Membership is free to anyone who has ever worked or studied in any of our membership organisations. So do please check our website and do sign up for your free membership if you can. We do a number of things such as events like this. We put other organisations together, we provide internship training, we provide training for people in evaluation and monitoring. We have an evaluation programme for development practitioners, which runs again this November. It's a part-time course that runs 2 weeks online, and there is information about it on our website. We're also holding an information session about that on the 7th of September. So please do check our social media feeds and our website if you'd like to sign up for that. We do news, we do blogs, we feature people's research. Again, if there's anything that you're interested in or would like to write for us about, just get in contact with us via our website or our socials. Our big thing is interdisciplinary research. We are very proud to lead a large project, a £20 million project, working across India, Indonesia and Senegal, looking at childhood stunting. The UKRI GCRF Hub is doing a lot of work with 19 partner organisations, and on the 8th of September hosts the inaugural Action Against Stunting Day. So please do check out their website and our website for information about that. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Dr. William Monteith, who will tell you a little bit more about what to expect from today's event and why it's important that we examine this topic. Thank you very much to our panelists from the World Bank and Uganda for joining us. We look forward to hearing your presentations.
Thanks so much, Shireen. And it's a real pleasure to be here and to moderate what promises to be a really engaging and timely discussion of the role of informality and informal workers in the time of COVID-19. Facilitated really by this comprehensive new report, which contains a number of really interesting points and findings, which I really hope we can pick up on both in the presentation and discussion, and the report entitled The Long Shadow of Informality. So as the report makes clear, the informal economy, or what I like to term the real economy, given that it's responsible for the vast majority of employment in many contexts in the Global South, continues to play a vital role in the context of the pandemic through its provision of essential goods, livelihood opportunities and safety nets to those that have been excluded by the deeply unjust rollout of COVID-19 vaccination networks. Yet at the same time, the people providing these services in the informal economy have been particularly vulnerable to both the health impacts of the pandemic and the social and economic impacts of lockdown and containment measures. Informal workers are often employed in locations where social distancing is difficult. At the same time, they are forced and more likely to be excluded by state support systems. Consequently, many have been forced to choose between starvation and contagion, and the ILO estimates that lockdown measures have increased relative poverty among informal workers by as much as 56%. In this sense, the pandemic has really underlined the paradoxical role of the informal economy as both a vital safety net and a space of exploitation and abandonment. In the absence of state support, informal workers have turned to their own organisations and institutions, from small savings rounds to larger associations and cooperatives, in order to implement their own health and safety measures, distribute their own protective equipment, and formulate their own visions of the future. They've also articulated clear demands, visible, for example, from recent reports published by WIGO, that's Women in Informal Employment, Globalising and Organising. And these demands range from short-term cash grants and debt forgiveness initiatives to the long-term reform of social protection programs, the removal of exclusionary legislation, and the provision of low-cost retail space in urban centres. The diversity of these demands and the different social, economic and geographical positions from which they are articulated raise a number of questions which I hope we can take forward in the discussion following the presentations. Firstly, in contexts in which informality is the norm, how useful is the formal-informal dichotomy for understanding what is happening on the ground? To what extent does it reveal more than it conceals about the various ways in which people produce goods and services and make a living in 2021? Second, to what extent is informality the cause of poor development outcomes or a symptom of these outcomes? And if the latter, how might global development initiatives such as the SDGs better recognise and build upon the contributions of informal workers? And thirdly, what opportunities might the COVID-19 pandemic provide for moving beyond the usual menu of policy responses to informality, for example, through the provision of more ambitious social protection programmes, including variants of universal basic income? But I'll now hand over for the presentations and for a summary of this fantastic new report, The Long Shadow of Informality, to the two authors, Dr. Franziska Ohnsorge and Dr. Xu Yu. So Dr. Franziska Ohnsorge is the manager of the Prospects Group of the World Bank. And prior to joining the World Bank, she worked at the International Monetary Fund and in the Office of the Chief Economist for the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Franziska has published on a range of topics in policy and academic publications and holds a PhD in economics from the University of Toronto. Dr. Xu Yu, who co-authors the report, is a senior economist with the Prospects Group in the Equitable Growth, Finance and Institutions Practice Group at the World Bank. Her main research interests are in development economics and political economy. Prior to joining the World Bank, she held a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Rochester and has also worked at the IMF and the Conference Board, holding a PhD in economics from the University of Groningen and a BSc in economics from Fudan University. Dr. Yu's recent papers have been published in journals including Public Choice, the Journal of Comparative Economics and International Organization. So it's a great pleasure to welcome the authors of this new report. So I'll now hand over to you, Franziska and Xu, to talk a little bit about your findings.
Let me start by, thank you, William. Let me start by thanking you for the introductory remarks and the organizers, especially Shireen John, for organizing this event. So, as William has already said, and as many of you who work in poorer countries know, that a large part of labor market activity occurs in the informal sector, and that's really what motivated our study. So today, my colleague Xu Yu and I want to give you a good sense of the scale of the informal sector, its features, both in the long term and the short term, and its behavior in emerging markets and developing economies, especially through the pandemic as well. So in the next 15 minutes, Xu and I will go through a few questions. Xu, over to you.
So we will structure today's presentation around the following 4 questions. First, we would like to talk about how important a problem is informality. Secondly, how can the informal economy hold back the current recovery from last year's record deep recession? And thirdly, what are the broader development challenges associated with the topic? And finally, we would like to present a menu of policy options. So what is informality? Everyone seems to be talking about different things when they talk about informality, but in a nutshell, there are two main reasons why workers and firms participate in the informal sector. Some join the informal sector due to necessity, out of necessity. This is very typical for low-skilled workers who are not productive enough who would not be productive enough in the formal sector. Their income will fall below the subsistence line if they do not work in the informal sector. This is a common situation in lower income countries. Others choose to join the informal sector voluntarily to avoid burdensome regulations or for its flexibility. This is typically more common in a middle income country or even higher income countries, especially if those countries have poor governance and regulation issues. And there are, as I just and there are so many definitions of informality. There are many reasons for informality, and there are also equally or even more number of definitions of informality. Here, we define the informal economy as market-based economic activities that are hidden from authorities for a variety of reasons. But these are legal activities. In other words, those economic activities should be included in official GDP, but they are currently not included. Here we show you the database we created. It is the largest and most comprehensive database for informality. It consists of the 12 most commonly used measures of informality and covers up to 196 countries over the period 1990 to 2018. We invite you to take a look at our website, www.worldbank.org/informal-economy. You can download the database and look at it into more details. And every measure has its pros and cons. If you would be interested in it, I can elaborate on that later during the discussion, probably. And all these measures, as we show in the book, are consistent with each other in generally. But at the same time, there seem to be three distinct dimensions of informality, which is summarized here. They are the output informality, employment informality, and perceived informality. For the purpose of today's presentation, we will focus our discussion among two measures of informality. One would be the dynamic general equilibrium model-based estimates on informal output. The other one would be the self-employment as a share of total employment as a proxy for informal employment. So how large is the informal economy? On average, the informal economy accounts for about 1/3 of output in emerging markets and developing economies. And as you can see from the left panel, informality is common across all EMD regions. But it takes different forms in each region. As you can see from this panel, we show both the level of informal output and the level of informal employment. Informal output is most pervasive in regions such as Sub-Saharan Africa, Europe, Central Asia, and Latin America and the Caribbean. At the same time, informal employment is most common in East Asia, South Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. When we compare these two bars, the large gap, it means the relative productivity of the informal sector, or the informal sector labor productivity will be relatively lower than their formal counterparts. Therefore, what we can see from this chart is that labor productivity in the informal sector is relatively lower than the formal sector in East. This is a more phenomenon in East Asia and the Pacific, South Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. During the past 3 decades, we have been seeing output informality declining across all EMD regions. The most declines has been seen in regions with the fast economic growth, such as East Asia Pacific and South Asia. At the same time, moderate decline was seen in Middle, East, and North Africa, probably largely due to its moderate economic growth during the past and also entrenched poor governance. Now we know that the informal sector constitutes a large share of economic activities in emerging markets and developing economies. The real concern now is that the informal sector is threatening to hold back the current recovery from last year's record deep recession. Our concerns are based on three considerations. First, the informal sector was hit particularly hard during the pandemic. Second, macroeconomic stimulus are struggling to gain traction in those countries. Lastly, the historical precedent show that the informal sector can hold back recoveries. So in 2020, we see that a lot of countries used lockdown to deal with COVID-19. And the lockdowns that stopped economic activities in the service sector hit informal firms particularly hard, largely due to the fact that they are overrepresented in the service sector. As you can see from the left chart, the very left chart, informal sector accounts for 3/4 of the firms in the service sector. The ratio dropped to 1/3 when we are looking at firms at manufacturing sector. And not only the lockdowns could affect income, could induce income losses in those among informal workers, they also virtually have no access to social protection programs, social insurance programs. As you can see from the middle panel, only 4% of the population in countries with above median output informality have access to unemployment benefits. And the income and also informal workers tend to have very limited savings to fall back on. As you can see from the right panel, about 40% of the population in countries with above median output informality will be driven into extreme poverty after they have to cover out-of-pocket payments for unexpected medical causes, especially things like hospitalization due to COVID. Not only the informal sector was hit particularly hard during the pandemic, government also find government policies would be less effective in countries with a large informal sector. Take a fiscal stimulus, for instance. We see that fiscal stimulus will be more limited in countries with a higher level of informality, and this could be largely due to the fact that government revenues are more limited in countries with a larger informal sector. As you can see from the left panel, government revenues will be significantly lower in countries with above median informality by about 5 to 12 percentage points of GDP than those with below median informality. And take monetary stimulus, which usually work through the formal financial system. They also are less effective in countries with a larger informal sector. The reason is that the banking system or the financial system, the formal financial system, will also be shallower in countries with a larger informal sector. Only 20% of the firms have access to back finance in countries with above median output informality. And the most important reason for the concern now is that the informal sector could hold back and dampen the current recovery. This is based on the historical precedent. Of course, it is possible that this time could be different, but the historical precedent, as we show here, is that a 1% change in output, in formal output, could lead to 0.4% to 0.8% increase in informal output. However, when we look at informal employment, the fluctuation in the formal sector does not lead to significant changes in informal employment. This suggests that the informal labor market could be responding to formal sector in ways such as like changes in wages and number of working hours rather than the employment status. The muted responses of the informal sector would be a blessing during economic downturns, as it provides job income buffers and job opportunities. However, it turns into a curse during recoveries. Past studies have been looking at this. They tend to focus on the downturns and use Latin America and the Caribbean as a case. However, as we can show here, that the informal sector can also dampen the recoveries. And Franziska probably can talk. Franziska will talk more about the broader developmental challenges associated with informality. from here?
Yeah, thank you. So Shu showed you the short-term challenges of informality. Shu, can I have control of the screen? Can I share my screen? But at the country level, informality is associated with a whole host of indicators of underdevelopment. That goes back to William's initial question: is informality a symptom or a cause? So here we illustrate just some of them, a few of them, as an example. The red bar is always the average for countries that have low informality, and the blue bar is the average for countries that have high informality. So the average GDP per capita, agriculture, extreme poverty, and control of corruption. In general, EMDs with the highest informality, the red bars, have low the blue bars have low per capita GDP. They're still largely rural. They have high extreme poverty headcounts, and they have poor governance. And one of the reasons that Shu already is one of the reasons for these poor development outcomes may be that government revenues are lower in countries with high informality. But it's not just that they're lower. The chart on the left shows you also that the composition is tilted towards a more unequal composition. What happens is that in countries with a lot of informality, there is much less income tax revenue collection. But to raise revenues, they have to rely on import trade taxes that can very easily be collected at the border, or more easily be collected at the border. So it's a less redistributive tax system. And on the expenditure side also, you see that expenditures are not just lower in countries with a lot of informality. They're also tilted away from expenditures like health and education. So that's one of the reasons that informality is associated with all these poor development outcomes. At the worker level, at the microeconomic level, something similar is happening. We conducted here a meta-analysis of all the studies we could find that estimate the wage premium in the formal sector. So how much are workers in the formal sector paid more than workers in the informal sector? And it turns out, if you look at the chart on the right, across all the studies here, on average, workers in the formal sector are paid 19% more than workers in the informal sector. But what is interesting here, and that goes back to William's question about symptom and cause. If you then use only the studies that control for worker characteristics, you find that that wage premium is no longer statistically significant. So that means that this wage premium of 90% for formal workers can be explained essentially by the type of workers that select into the informal sector. So these workers tend to be unskilled and inexperienced. Once you control for that, there's not much of a wage premium left. So it's a problem of the most vulnerable population selecting into informal employment. And that has implications for what policymakers can do. First, it depends, as a policymaker, what should you do? The question can, of course, not be answered without understanding what's the main driver of informality. Going back to Shu's original chart. Now, you need to know why do workers and firms join the formal sector. Is it because they have to, or is it because they want to? Yeah, is it because they cannot find any employment anywhere else? Remember that wage premium that can be explained by worker characteristics. Or is it because they find it inconvenient to be in the formal sector? So really, the policies need to be tailored to country circumstances. Second, we conduct in this book a study, a series of exercises, what happened to informality after policy changes. And we find that every policy change had a significant effect statistically, but not economically. So every reform can help a bit at the margin, reducing informality, but really there is no silver bullet. No single reform can give you a big bang of an impact to reduce informality. And that's probably because informality is both cause and symptom of underdevelopment. What it needs is a comprehensive package of reforms. And finally, going back, remember that wage premium again, that goes away once you account for the type of workers that select into the informal sector. Really, this is about long-term development. You need to improve the human capital of the people who are now self-selecting into the informal economy. You need to improve the productivity of the firms that are self-selecting into the informal economy. So it's about long-term development, increasing productivity, increasing worker human capital. And I'm happy to later in the discussion go back to some specific policy ideas. So to summarize, shows in my presentation, informality is widespread. On average, bear that in mind, it accounts for 1/3 of employment and output in emerging markets and developing economies, and you can find it everywhere. It's not like it's all only in Africa. And it creates both short-term and long-term challenges. So in the short term now, of course, that we're coming out of the COVID recession, there is a concern that it'll hold back the recovery from last year's record deep recession. But the problem goes well beyond the short term. It's also about the long term. It's associated with a host of development challenges. So any policy effort to address informality needs to be a comprehensive package of reforms that's tailored to country circumstances and really targeted at long-term development. And now we very much look forward to hearing from Innocent and to the discussion afterwards. Back to you, William.
Well, thanks so much, Shu and Franziska, for that great overview. The idea now is to move from the global to the local picture, if you like, by bringing in the perspective of Innocent Silva. So Innocent is projects coordinator with the Kampala City Council Authority in Uganda, the agency responsible for administrating Uganda's capital city. So the KCCA is in charge of the entire public service and delivery portfolio for Kampala, with the exception of water and electricity. And during his time with the authority, Innocent has developed and implemented hard and soft initiatives touching various areas of urban living. He is certified both as a project management professional and a public administrator, with specialized postgraduate training in population studies, urban management, and corporate strategy. So we now hand over to Innocent with the hope really of grounding some of these kind of local processes and findings very much within Uganda and Kampala, to hear a little bit about how some of these questions of informality play out from the perspective of somebody in the day-to-day work of public administration. And just to say, if you have any questions, please do pop them in the Q&A panel now as they come into your head, and we will get to them after Innocent's talk. But now over to you, Innocent.
For your thank you to Franziska and Shu for your presentation of this very important research. Indeed, probably the most complex study we have seen on informal economy. Make
Listen, it might just be my connection, but we can't hear you very well. So it might be worth pausing, and we can go to some of the questions just while you check see if your connection improves. We try again. If you just try again, just see if the connection's improving. Okay, great. That's good to know. It's not just me. So maybe Innocent, we'll just give you a minute or two, see if we can get you on a better connection, and then we'll bring you in. And just while we're doing that, maybe we could to come to some of the first questions from the first presentation. And so we have a question from an anonymous attendee for the first talk. In your experience, how do you differentiate between fallback occupations and genuine entrepreneurial pursuits within the informal sector? So I guess what's often been termed opportunity versus necessity entrepreneurship. And are there any current projects aimed at increasing informal enterprise productivity? Yeah, so that's a question for the first presenters.
Yeah, so we don't really distinguish. I suspect there is a very large gray line between fallback and opportunity. In the end, we're macroeconomists. In the end, what we witness is that people are in the informal sector for any number of reasons. So that could be desperation, I guess what you would call more the fallback, or it could be opportunity. No, I mean, that's probably what also explains some of these differences in wage premium. For example, in some Eastern European countries, the wage premium is negative. So the formal sector employees get less money than the informal ones, and that's an opportunity, I guess. For the policymaker, the challenge is then to identify what is the main driver for the majority of people, and then to implement policies that can address that. Now, you're right that firm product is critical to lift firm productivity, because if firms stay small, there's very little hope of bringing them into the formal sector. But that is about giving access to markets. That's about improving human capital. That's in some countries been about training. Training has helped. Training, entrepreneurial and financial training for entrepreneurs has helped. So there's a bunch of micro interventions, but also, especially in access to markets for selling things, but also for inputs like seeds or fertilizer. In access to markets, there's also a room for macroeconomic policies, like simply building, not even building, like paving roads.
Fantastic, thanks very much. Shu, I don't know if you wanted to come in, or I can follow on with the next question maybe, just while we wait for Innocent to return. Which, as you mentioned, skill in your presentation. And so I wondered, and the dominance of low-skilled workers in the informal economy. So I wonder how skill is defined for the purposes of the report. Because I mean, those of us that are familiar with informal marketplaces, for example, can see the ways in which informal work in many ways requires all kinds of different skill, right? I'm talking about from social skills to kind of soft skills of various kinds, in addition to just basic business skills to kind of make a living in what are often very dense and very competitive environments. So how is skill defined for the purpose of this project? And related to that, to what extent has the kind of larger number of graduates, I'm thinking particularly in sub-Saharan Africa in recent decades, so a more kind of formal definition of skill, resulted in gains in terms of formal employment or not?
So thank you very much, William, for the question. So we probably cannot give you a full answer because our book didn't really go in depth, and we tend to, so you probably would like to take a look at our 2019 January JEP, which is the Global Economic Prospects, which is flagship from the World Bank. And there we have a feature story about informality. And over there, we actually had a summary of all the past policies. So probably you know, as a person who work on the field, you know that there are so many studies talking about how those programs improve informality conditions in certain countries. And there are so many different type of programs, like access to formal education, access to entrepreneurial programs, and other things. What we did in that chapter is that we summarize all these studies in a qualitative kind of literature review. We summarize what have been published in the literature, what kind of programs have been used, and what is the impact. What we have seen is that training programs or those, although sometimes studies disagree on their final impact of those programs, they tend to have a beneficial impact on workers in the informal sector. And also in a study, we take a more macro approach looking at this problem, where we see that, as you mentioned, that the workers need a broader set of skills. And what we find in countries with above median informality, those access to basic education is limited. The access to entrepreneurial type of education, both during the elementary, middle school, even to the university level, is also more limited in countries with above median informality. So not only that informality could be associated with joining a low skill sector out of necessity, it also doesn't necessarily entail a nurturing environment for entrepreneurship in general.
Fantastic, thanks, Shu. We have some other fantastic questions. I just want to see if we can bring Innocent in before we open them up. Innocent.
Hello. Hello, can you hear me, Will?
That's much better. Yeah, fantastic.
Right. Thank you, and sorry about that glitch. Thank you for your patience again, and thank you, Shu and Franziska, for your presentation. of course, the points you make are valid and very important. But for somebody like me who, lives in the actual reality of what is being discussed here as informal, living in a emerging market or developing economy, the questions around reconciling the reality and the theory, if you like, can be a bit of a struggle. So drawing the lines between what is informal and informal, characterizing the people that we are responsible for serving as city managers is a bit difficult. Is formality, informality a dichotomy, or is it a continuum? Indeed, if it is a continuum, at what point does it, stop being one and become the other? Is informality complete? Is it or can there be parts about a business or a person, either in terms of registration or practices, that can be one or the other? So is it like possible to be in that dual state? And again, what has been talked about, is informality a cause or a symptom? Or is informality sort of the only choice that people who live in the sorts of environments that they live, is it the only choice they have for any sort of productive activity? Of course, a country like Uganda, which falls square in the definition of an EMD, and Kampala City accounts, which is the capital city of Uganda, accounts for about 65% of the economy, of economic output, and close to 70% of this can be categorized as informal. Our realities that we are a very young, economy. We are 5th youngest in the world. 77% of the population is under 30, and those are also the ones who are more represented, actually overrepresented in informal activity. 3.3% growth rate is one of the highest growth rates in the world. Onto that, you layer issues of politics, which have been touched about in the research, but the political environment that we have for a lot of the young people who are the majority of the population, they feel that the political environment is exclusive. It concentrates power, opportunity, wealth, etc. in the hands of very few, based on cronyism, tribalism, political expediency, etc. That in itself sort of drives young people who are again the majority of the population to seek alternative informal economic activities. The tax regime has also been seen to be incoherent, oppressive in some ways, and generally government is looked at as detached, bloated, a burden, etc. So all these realities, as you can see, they sort of bias a young person, even one who has attained an education. And to this, I want to speak to what I have heard said a few times even today about unskilled or low-skilled workers. We see that there is an increasing number of young people with the necessary employable skills, but who are gravitating mostly towards informal labor. So it is not so much a sort of it's the only option they have because they are unable to be productive in the formal sector. So these realities really make it difficult for formal employment to be a viable choice for the majority of the population. well, which makes one wonder whether this, I know Franziska said, no, there is no silver bullet. And I believe it's not, a straight line of, informal is bad and formal is good, and therefore we should move in that direction. But it does raise some questions on where really that is the development path necessarily that should be chosen by a country such as Uganda. When you are looking at the policy objectives, how attainable is that shift, if you like, from the informal to formal? And what are all, how do we navigate all of these barriers that stand in the way of that shift from informal to formal? So many, lots of questions. I'm conscious as well that we lost some time, so I want to leave it here for now, and perhaps you can build on it in the discussions. Back to you, Will.
Thanks so much, Innocent. That's fantastic. We have a variety of questions you mentioned. Some of the early questions that come to mind are on definitions and on the kind of structural drivers or causes of poverty and informality. And so the first set of questions are around how we can accurately measure the impact that informality has on the formal economy. And then Lorna asks how the way we measure informality might influence the type of government support that's provided in different settings, which in turn connects to Madhu's question, which connects to a question about the role of government. The extent to which the types of policies that Franziska and Shu have suggested are contingent on political will and government support in particular contexts. So if we start with those questions maybe, and then we'll move to Marta's question from the chat after that. And perhaps for Innocent, maybe some reflections in Uganda on the extent to which informality has been a kind of important political goal or objective or not in recent years. But first over to Franziska and Shu.
Shu, do you want to start?
Okay, so probably I can take the first question, that is talking about how the informal economy can constrain the formal sector. So in our study, our emphasis was more on how the informal sector respond to fluctuations in the formal sector. But if you look at literature, if you look at a long-run growth kind of perspective, the informal sector could constrain the growth in the formal sector as well. Because as we were talking about the wage premium in the formal sector, it basically entails the productivity between the two sectors. And people who are trained or having working experience in the formal sector actually accumulate more human capital than the informal sector over the long run. So that is a human capital, that how it can influence the long run formal sector development. Another thing is the fact that the informal sectors have no access to financial market, that it constrains the capital accumulation and technology advancement in that sector, which also can, as a whole, can influence the formal sector, because they are all because there's this supply linkage between the formal and informal sector that it brings down the total TFP in the economy. So these are the two main reasons I'm thinking about at the moment. Maybe Franziska, you would like to add anything?
Not on this question, but on the other questions. This question about the role of government in informality actually links also to what Innocent said, that even the educated people choose informality because the government is just insufferably burdensome. And that's a classic middle income problem. This is the type of inequality that is faced a lot in Latin America, is faced in Eastern Europe. It's just unmanageably difficult to navigate the regulations for taxes and business regulations. So there is a clear policy implication on that one, which is to streamline the regulations, to make them manageable, but also then to enforce them. So it needs both prongs, not just streamlining, but also enforcement then of the streamlined regulations. And that is something that can encourage people who are productive, who are well educated, to push them, even if they're just self-employed entrepreneurs, to push them into the formal economy where they register, where they pay taxes, but with more reasonable tax regulations and tax burdens. So that's a classic type of middle income informality phenomenon. And then, of course, there's the other type of people that I suppose are also present in Uganda, the ones that are not educated, the ones that would not thrive in the formal sector with any regulations. So for them, it's really about building access to markets so they can sell their produce, or building their human capital, better schooling. But that takes time. That's a long-term development kind of policy. And yes, these things require a lot of political will, because there will be big pushback to any of these policy changes. Probably not to education, it's more about financing. But to tax changes, there can be a lot of pushback, because in the enforcement part, because it's difficult to enforce taxes. No, it's difficult in any country. It's even more difficult if it is something that has to be stepped up, even of more streamlined regulations.
Thanks, Franziska. Innocent, I don't know if you want to come in there.
Thank you, Will. I'll respond more specifically to the question that you posed, the extent to which informality, if you like, has been used as an important political tool. Look, in Franziska's presentation, I saw something about informality and the sort of political environment in which it thrives. In countries such as ours, where we have had the same regime for 35 years plus, and in a country where 77% of the population is under 30, you inevitably have got to create a system, if you like, which helps to prop that. And very often you find that you've got to rely on very formal practice. So to an extent, government formal rates, reliance on informal systems. So if we speak more specifically, when it comes to the stimulus,
you're just breaking up a little bit there, but I think we got most of what you were saying, and talking about contextualizing this kind of recent policy shift, if you like, in relation to the longer history of government and governance in countries like Uganda, and maybe going back to thinking about informality as the historical norm rather than the exception, and the ways in which that might shape contemporary debates and the ways in which it's kind of understood and interpreted in institutions such as KCCA. Did you have anything else for now? I'll come back in a second. Maybe we can check your connection.
No. Sure.
Okay, so let's come back to that. So going back to the questions, we had a question from in the chat early on from Abdul, asking about the extent to which the kind of structural drivers of informality and the extent to which informality is driven by a lack of formal jobs. And then a broader question opened up by Marta. So Marta, I don't know if you're here, if you'd be willing to come in with your question. Great. I think if you unmute yourself, or if Shireen or Alicia are able to bring Marta in, then please go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes. Thanks, Marta. Hi.
Excellent. Sorry, because I was just trying to change between speakers so that you can actually hear me. Thank you so much for this. This was extremely interesting. And my question was, to overall locate the discussion on informal economy within the structural causes and the understanding of structural causes of poverty and underdevelopment. So in this case, we can have a more nuanced understanding of the reasons the workers enter informal economy, and also how then we can really look at the informal economy more in its broader understanding of being a symptom of underdevelopment, a symptom of poverty, a symptom of lack of institutions, lack of proper governance, etc. So in this case, I found that from my learnings on informal economy, there's often a misconception of it, and sort of it's misconstrued to be linked with illegality. And I really welcome this very clear distinction that was made in your presentation, because that is something that is often quite upsetting to see that it is actually misunderstood this way. And the second thing that it is also, I think that the debate on the cause and the symptom is very interesting. I am more on the spectrum of it being a symptom. And therefore my question was how to link your macro approach into the debate and the understanding, a more nuanced understanding of the structural causes of poverty, inequality, and informality. And then also to really link this with policy responses to informality also have to be located within that broader nuanced understanding of the structural causes. Because of course, if you're looking, for example, at policies that would be pro-poor, then obviously simply bringing taxation would lead to double burdening of the informal workers doing it out of necessity. And similarly, again, as you know, the debate on political will and the debates that Innocent also brought in this full understanding of different levels of cronyism, corruption, different levels of how the systems really work in place. I think it's really important to then really locate it in those structural causes and the policies to address the structural causes, which then broadly would lead to gradual emergence of people out of informality into the obviously the ideal state where everyone has access to education, everyone has access to healthcare, everyone has work benefits, etc. So I think my question is, and I'm sorry, it's a long sort of answer, but it would be really interesting to see how you're planning to maybe link the macro approach and your excellent data to then the debate on structural causes and to more pro-poor policy prescriptions. Thank you very much.
This is exactly the point. And I think this is also what has reflected the shift in the thinking, or what reflects a shift in the thinking about informality over the last 2-3 decades. It used to be all about we need to reduce informality. I think now there's a much broader recognition that really that it's not isolated. There's no point in forcing down informality if it doesn't come with all these other development policies. So reducing any effort to reduce informality is really about any effort to improve development. It is part of a package. So any policy that is only targeted at informality will not last, will not achieve much. And there have been various studies of, for example, efforts to improve registration by firms. It hasn't done much. Yes, they've registered, but they haven't grown. They haven't paid more taxes. So these little efforts here and there that are really targeted at informality, they're unlikely to last or do much on a big scale. That's why our emphasis is also about the long term. We see that there's damage from informality in the short term. That was Shu's presentation about the cyclical short-term problems. We see that there's damage from informality, or whether it's cause or effect, it comes with bad outcomes in the long term too. And there's a concern that this is a trap. It's self-reinforcing equilibrium. It's just all underdevelopment, just part and parcel of underdevelopment. So the only policies that can hope to achieve something is exactly the policies you mentioned, these long-term development policies. Reductions in poverty, improvements in education, better infrastructure so people can actually reach the market, better access to resources. So deserving firms have access to finance. Even women-run farms have access to fertilizers. like a bunch of development, long-term classic development policies are more likely to achieve a decline in informality than anything targeted at informality per se.
So can I add a couple of sentences here? So thank you very much for the question. It's indeed a very interesting question. So Franziska have already talked about our emphasis on having a policy package, but I also want to mention some of the findings of the book. So for instance, like as you mentioned that certain policies like taxation, it has an impact on informality. In our paper, in our chapter 5 or 6, the final chapter, the policy chapter, we show that a reduction in policy rate does induce a reduction in informality over the medium term. However, as Franziska was saying, the size is really tiny. It's like it is significant, but it is really, really small. So only if it is not really enough. We also find financial development, further financial development could have an impact on reducing informality, but at the same time, the economic size is really tiny. So in that sense, we show that all the good policies can work, but they have to work together. And it's only small policy changes here and there will not lead to long-lasting or big results. And another thing we also want to emphasize is the fiscal angle of this story. So people were all saying, the informal economy provides our job opportunities in income buffer during recessions. But if you look at the long run, if you want to have propel policies or redistributive policies, most of the time it works through the fiscal system. However, when you have a large informal sector, the government revenue is really limited. The government cannot do much in terms of supporting productivity growth or infrastructure building if their revenue space is limited. And at the same time, also we show that the revenue composition will be tilted towards a less redistributive region when you have a large informal sector that they cannot collect any direct taxes from the corporate or from personal income. So these are the things that can also threaten, could also make the informal sector have an impact on the formal sector. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Xu and Franziska, for that really interesting and engaging question. So working through other questions, early on, Meenakshi, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, you had a question and a kind of comment based on your experience in the healthcare sector. So if you're there, please do come in. Otherwise I can move to other questions. So maybe while we're waiting, see if Meenakshi is happy to come in with her question. We had another question around from Victoria around correlation versus causation, specifically for Xu. Talking about the informal sector as holding back economic recovery. Victoria asks, given its ease of entry, could it not be argued the reverse? Another attendee asks, what are the risks of informality beyond economic recovery? So thinking about the relationship between informality and other forms of fragility on social and political levels. And then some interesting connections back to the global north, perhaps, and so-called developed economies. I think it's interesting in the report that you premise it by talking about the decline of informality in recent years. And I thought that was interesting because I read it alongside increasing kind of literature in the global north, which is talking about the informalization of work in so-called developed economies. So whether you see a kind of global trajectory one way or the other, or whether basically patterns are very different from region to region. But I thought that those kind of trends are interesting for maybe reversing historical assumptions of kind of a convergence towards formalization. These do raise a kind of more provocative final set of questions about the end of informality as being either probable or desirable, but I think we'll come to that in a final round. So maybe just for now, in case you have any responses to those questions, and then we can have a final round.
So maybe I can go first about your question about declining informality and rising informality in advanced economies. This is also something we find when we're working on this, but our focus of the book is mainly on the emerging markets and developing economies, which shows a declining trend. So in terms of in the rising informality, we do see that during the past 3 decades, there's also a decline in advanced economy in terms of informal output. But in recent years, there are countries with a rising rise in self-employment rate, especially, so for instance, like in Japan, in UK, and in other norths, especially during pandemic, with the gig economy rising. I think there is this Oxford Online Labor Index showing showing online labor gig economy has been rising during the pandemic. So this is as you just mentioned that the two trends are actually talking about different things. One about moving from the rural area towards the urban service sector, in that way, and also slowly going into the manufacturing, the kind of the growing process. And in the advanced economy, it's more about flexibility, the gig economy that is emergent. However, there's also the rise of the gig economy and advanced economy brings both challenges and opportunities. The opportunity that they really created flexible work arrangements for which are probably favorable for especially during the pandemic and also for female workers. But at the same time, there are also missing regulations in that sector that can also cause issues, like some of the workers in certain countries without specific regulations, that they don't have any access to unemployment benefits, or they find it very hard to file for unemployment benefits under the pandemic. So these are the things that could be also a downside of the rising informality in advanced economies. So Franziska, would you like?
Nothing to add on this, but I want to come back to this recovery being held back by informality. So what we find is that actually it's not so easy to enter and exit informal employment. What tends to happen is that it's just sticky. Who's there will remain informal regardless of what happens to the formal economy. Who it was not there doesn't enter. See, remember that chart that Shu showed you, where there's essentially no response of informal employment status, yeah, yes or no, to the business cycle. So it's not so easy to just enter the informal economy when there's a recession, or to exit it when things start up. What tends to happen, we suspect, I mean, we don't have proof, but just putting together the output response and the employment response, what tends to happen is that people are in the informal economy and they adjust their hours up and down. The intensity of work, not just the yes or no employment status. The risk with having a lot of informal economy, or making it very easy to enter the informal economy, is that it becomes a trap. You hear that sometimes also as a broad-based policy prescription. Informality should be encouraged because governments are just so rotten. It's better to have a thriving informal sector that undermines the government. Yeah, because the government can't spend the money, right? That may well be true in the short term. The problem is then that the whole economy may be in an equilibrium that is undesirable, where everything is underdeveloped. And the way out of it is not one particular policy to raise informality, but really broader development that improves government efficiency as well, so people are happy, willing to pay taxes and don't feel they're wasted. But at the risk with inviting informality as a way of undermining the government, because one doesn't trust the government, is that you end up in a very underdeveloped equilibrium where everything is self-reinforcing and becomes very difficult to exit it.
Fantastic, thanks very much, Franziska. I was reminded when you were talking, also linking back to the earlier points on skills and tertiary education and Innocent's point, something that I've become aware of and interested in Uganda in recent years and in the UK is the rise of the so-called side job or occupational straddling, and particularly the ways in which graduates in particular, as well as others, operate side jobs or businesses in the informal economy alongside seeking out opportunities longer term for formal employment. And the challenges of that for methodologically also for measurement when we're measuring informal employment, what challenges does that pose and to what extent are those people, is occupational straddling represented in those statistics, and to what extent is it as a kind of growing phenomenon? But in the spirit of kind of rounding up, I think there's a couple of provocative questions in the Q&A, which maybe can be summarized as follows. To what extent is the end of informality desirable? Question one. and to what extent is it possible? Maybe question 2. And perhaps we can bring in Innocent there as well, for thinking about the context, particularly in Kampala, the extent to which Kampala City Council sees informality really as a long-term challenge which needs to be addressed, or rather as a kind of contextual factor that it needs to work with as it makes its plans for the kind of development of Kampala as a specific city. But maybe if we begin with Franziska and Shu, and then give Innocent the final word on that.
So about the end of informality. So the end of informality would not be zero informality, just like unemployment would not be zero employment. There will be natural. So in our idea, that it was not really specifically elaborated in a book, but there's also a possibility there's a natural rate of informality based on the country's economic development and its structural and also a bit of the cultural background. So because there is a paper showing that there's a kind of a non-linear relationship between economic development and informality. So at a certain rate, at a certain economic development rate, there will be still maybe 10% or 20% of the population that choose the informal sector for its flexibility. This is particularly in the case of female workers, that they find it very hard to have a 9-to-5 jobs, and they would at the same time they would like to care for their kids. So in that end, the informality would not, the end of informality would not be zero informality. There will always be a tolerated rate of informality. The problem is that when it is too high, it threatens long-term economic development, then it becomes a problem. So that's my sense here.
Yeah, I agree. So the end of informality is neither possible nor desirable, probably at zero, but near zero would be desirable in principle, because it would be a symptom of a prosperous society where everyone's well educated, everyone has broad access to resources, governments are efficient. You would not have near zero informality if it wasn't in the environment of a prosperous society. Back to you.
Thank you. And Innocent.
Thank you, Will. On the question of whether Kampala Capital City Authority sees informality as a reality or as a contextual challenge within which to operate, absolutely. I agree with both Shu and Franziska. This is not something that's going to go away tomorrow. We will not have zero informality. In our case, it would be a miracle if we reduced informality to 20%, for example. So this is something that we have to deal with, but also to understand better, to understand that informality, there is no straight line from informal to formal. There is all shades in between, and how do you work with that? And within the context of informality as well, what do you want to deal with? I saw a question in the chat earlier, which was talking about governments wanting to, end informality or deal with informality as this big amorphous thing. But within that, what do you want to do? What do you want to deal with? Is registering all businesses, for example, dealing with informality? I do not think so. And even businesses which are informal, meaning not registered, for example, can actually have very formal business practices. And so you've got to sort of see what is it that you're trying to deal with. Is it the legalese, or is it the practices, or is it a combination of those two? And what comes first, as opposed to sort of broad strokes in terms of definition, which at a policy level really end up being counterproductive, especially in the context of very widespread informality such as ours.
Thanks so much, Innocent. So we're running out of time. We've had a few last comments in the Q&A. Karen is asking about opportunities to increase wages for those considered low skilled. So perhaps questions about opportunities for if not minimum incomes, then kind of initiatives to standardize wages outside of the context of the formal economy. And then relatedly, Monica, who is here representing an organization of street vendors in Latin America, is asking maybe about the kind of the ways in which formalization takes place on the ground, and the problem of taxation often being the first thing or the first step that informal workers encounter on this journey to formalization, and asking broader questions about how health needs can be met in the context of the pandemic. So I suggest that we get in touch with Monica actually after the, perhaps after the discussion, given that we've run out of time. So on that, I'm gonna have to thank Shu, Franziska and Innocent for the fantastic presentations and interventions. Thanks to everyone else for their questions. And I will now hand over to Shireen to wrap us up.
Thank you very much. Yes, I echo that. Thank you very much to Innocent for joining us from Uganda. I think it's certainly very welcome to hear what you had to say, and thank you so much for overcoming the technical demons that were trying to silence you. I'm glad you prevailed. Thank you so much to Dr. Ohnsorge and Dr. Yu for joining us. I noticed that somebody has posted a link to your original report, the one that prompted me to get in touch with you initially, in the chat. So I suggest that people do get hold of that and read it. And particularly, thank you so much to Will for being so helpful, so approachable, and so kind throughout this process, and for expertly managing the event today. Just a quick reminder, please keep in touch with us via Twitter at LIDC_UK. Please check out the inaugural Action Against Stunting Day on 8th of September. We would really love to see a lot of you there. Please help us share news of the event. There's also the links in the chat. And if you're interested in evaluation and monitoring, come along to our evaluation short course information session next on the 7th of September next week. Thanks very much for everyone's input and help today. I hope you've learned something. I certainly have, and we'll be posting a recording of this webinar shortly. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again. Bye.